Something happened to Prince Louis that the palace spent months refusing to explain. One day he was there, bouncing on the balcony, covering his ears at the flyover, stealing every frame he appeared in. Except then he was gone.
The room had gone unusually quiet when William and Catherine finally addressed the question royal watchers had been asking for months. Why had Prince Louis been kept so far from the public eye? What followed was an emotional explanation that reportedly left those listening stunned. Behind the smiles, ceremonies, and carefully planned appearances, the young prince's absence had apparently been tied to circumstances few people understood. As William and Catherine revealed more, the story took an unexpected turn. What really happened to Louis, and why was the truth kept hidden for so long? Let's uncover it. Catherine finally broke the royal script. For a while, something about Prince Louis was noticeably different. The youngest son of Prince William and Princess Catherine had been appearing far less often in public, and before long, royal watchers began asking the same question. Why had Louis suddenly disappeared from the spotlight? Then, new photographs emerged, showing the young prince smiling again. At first, the images seemed reassuring. Louis looked happy, relaxed, and completely at ease. But instead of ending the questions, the photographs only made people more curious. What had really been happening behind the palace walls? According to claims surrounding the family, Louis's reduced public appearances came during an unusually difficult period for the Wales family. King Charles was dealing with cancer treatment.
King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today after experiencing of his cancer treatment.
And William suddenly had to carry a much heavier share of royal duties. At the same time, Catherine was focused on her own recovery and on keeping life as steady as possible for George, Charlotte, and Louis. For the children, that meant one thing became especially important: privacy. And Louis, being the youngest, was reportedly given even more protection from cameras, questions, and the constant attention that comes with being a royal child. But then came the part of the story that made everything far more intriguing. Catherine was allegedly preparing to address the subject herself. According to the account, palace advisors had already prepared carefully written remarks for her. The words had reportedly been reviewed in advance, just as royal statements usually are. Everything was supposed to be controlled. Everything had a place. Then, supposedly, Catherine changed course. As the camera began recording, she reportedly looked down at the prepared pages. And instead of simply reading what had been written for her, she allegedly turned the papers face down. What happened next was said to be completely different from the polished royal message that had been planned. Catherine reportedly began speaking about Louis in her own words. And as she continued, the emotion apparently became impossible to hide. According to the claims, her eyes filled with tears. She became visibly emotional but continued speaking, choosing not to stop the recording or return to the prepared script. That detail is what makes the story so striking. Inside the royal family, public communication is rarely spontaneous. Every important statement can be carefully written, checked, approved, and timed. When the subject involves royal children, that control becomes even more important. So imagine the significance of a moment when Catherine allegedly pushed those carefully prepared words aside and spoke from the heart instead. If the account is accurate, this was never really just about why Louis had been seen less often. It was about a mother reaching a point where protecting her child became more important than following the palace script. And perhaps that explains why this story has generated so much attention. Because behind the titles, the cameras, and the royal protocol, Catherine was not simply Princess Catherine in that moment. She was a mother determined to protect her youngest son. But what could have inspired Louis's disappearance? What about his older siblings? What kept them from being hidden? Let's find out. The Diana memory behind everything. When people wonder why Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis are seen so rarely, there is actually a much bigger story behind it. Their limited public appearances are not simply the result of busy schedules or royal tradition. For years, Prince William and Catherine have followed a careful plan designed to protect their children while allowing them to grow up as normally as possible. It began soon after George was born in 2013. Within about a year, William and Catherine had already started shaping the kind of childhood they wanted for their children. And according to more recent reporting, that approach was designed to last for roughly 10 years. Nothing was supposed to happen by accident. They thought carefully about where the children would appear, how often they would be photographed, which events they would attend, and when they would gradually become more visible as members of the royal family. And if you look closely, the pattern has been there all along. The three children may appear together at Christmas in Sandringham, on the Buckingham Palace balcony during major celebrations, or at a carefully selected sporting event. Then, just as quickly, they disappear from public view again. But there is another detail that makes the strategy even more interesting. Many of the most personal photographs released to the public are taken by Catherine herself. Rather than allowing photographers to follow every step of her children's lives, she often takes the pictures and decides when they should be shared. That may sound like a small decision, but it gives the family something extremely valuable: control. When Catherine releases a photograph herself, the family decides what the world gets to see. There is no need for strangers to capture an unplanned moment and sell it to the highest bidder. The picture comes from the family, on the family's terms. And perhaps the reason William is so determined about this goes back to something he experienced as a teenager. In September 1997, William was only 15 years old when he walked behind his mother, Princess Diana's coffin, through the streets of London. Millions watched. Cameras followed every movement. The whole world seemed to be looking directly into the family's grief. But the invasion didn't end with Diana's funeral. After her death, private pieces of her life began appearing in public. Letters were published. Her handwriting was examined. Personal belongings were displayed and sold. Even recordings of her voice that were never intended for millions of strangers eventually became public. William was 15 years old when he witnessed all of this. He saw, up close, what could happen when the private life of a royal becomes public property. And that memory may explain why the doors around his own children have remained so carefully closed. For almost 3 decades, William has had every reason to believe that protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis means controlling access to them before the world demands more. And that is where this entire story really begins. How has Prince William handled his children's public appearance? What seemed to have changed about Prince Louis? Keep watching. The mystery behind Louis's sudden absence. For months, something about Prince Louis had been quietly changing. The youngest child of Prince William and Catherine had always lived under a different kind of royal spotlight. At 8 years old, Louis was still very much a child, and his parents had worked hard to give him something remarkably rare for a young royal: a normal childhood away from constant cameras. His older brother, Prince George, now 13, already carries the weight of a future king. His sister, Princess Charlotte, 11, has also become increasingly confident at official appearances. Louis, however, has been allowed to remain in the background, and that was exactly how William and Catherine wanted it. But then people began noticing something. Louis started missing public events that he had previously attended. Family occasions came and went without him. Some appearances that had reportedly been expected simply never happened. At first, nobody thought much of it. Children miss events. Plans change. But then the absences continued. Royal watchers began looking back at photographs and calendars, trying to work out when Louis had last been seen. Before long, a simple absence had turned into a growing question. Why wasn't Louis appearing anymore? And strangely, the very privacy his parents had created to protect him seemed to be making people even more curious. William reportedly responded by tightening the circle around his youngest son. Public engagements involving Louis were cancelled or quietly dropped, while the Prince of Wales remained unwilling to explain what was happening. From his perspective, there was a simple priority. Louis was a young boy, and his privacy mattered more than satisfying the public's curiosity. But inside the royal household, there were reportedly concerns about what that silence might eventually create. Royal schedules are not casual arrangements. Major engagements can be planned months in advance, announced publicly, and carefully documented. So when a child who normally appears at certain family occasions suddenly disappears from those events, people notice. Advisors reportedly remembered what happened with Catherine in 2024. Her limited public appearances and the lack of early information created a huge wave of speculation, with theories spreading long before the real situation became clear. They did not want history repeating itself. Some advisors, therefore, believed that a simple, carefully worded explanation about Louis could calm the growing curiosity without revealing anything deeply personal. William, however, reportedly remained unconvinced. To him, this was not a public relations problem waiting to be solved. It was his son. And if Louis was going through a period of confusion, discomfort, or emotional difficulty, William apparently believed that exposing him simply to silence the rumors would be the wrong choice. So the palace remained quiet. And with every passing week, that silence only made one question louder. What was really happening with Prince Louis? What strange thing has been noticed about Prince Louis lately? How did his older sibling feel about people's reaction around them? Stay with us. The silence that changed everything. The house did not change overnight. There was no dramatic argument, no slammed door, and no single moment when everything suddenly fell apart. Instead, something much quieter began to happen. Little by little, the silence spread through the household. George, at 13, was old enough to know that something was wrong. He could feel it in the pauses, the whispers, and the worried looks that disappeared whenever he walked into a room. But he was still too young to understand everything behind them. So he did what many children do when they sense that their family is struggling. He tried to become easier to handle. He became quieter, more careful, more willing to stay out of the way. From the outside, his parents might have thought he was coping remarkably well. But perhaps George wasn't really coping. Perhaps he had simply decided that someone needed to remain calm, and he would be that person. Then there was Charlotte. At 11, she noticed things adults might have assumed she missed. She noticed doors being closed. She noticed conversations suddenly stopping. She noticed the way people exchanged looks without saying what they were thinking. Nobody had given her the full story, but Charlotte slowly began putting the pieces together herself. And instead of asking for attention, she turned her attention toward Louis. She started leaving little handwritten jokes beside his bed. Sometimes they were silly. Sometimes they probably made no sense at all. But she kept doing it because she had discovered something important. Whenever Louis laughed, even for a few seconds, he seemed to return to the boy they all knew. Then one day, Charlotte overheard adults talking about public attention. She asked her mother a simple question. Were strangers worried about Louis? Catherine answered gently, but Charlotte wasn't finished. Her next question was much harder. Will Louis have to answer all of them? For an 11-year-old, that was an extraordinary burden to carry. Catherine sat with her and tried to explain that some things simply needed time. She spoke calmly, even though she was carrying fears of her own. Behind that calm expression were nights of little sleep and worries she did not want William to see. And William was doing almost exactly the same thing. He was hiding his own fears because he didn't want Catherine to carry even more. Neither of them realized what was happening between them. They were both trying to protect each other so carefully that they had slowly stopped telling each other how they truly felt. That is the strange thing about prolonged stress. It doesn't always create shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, it simply makes people quieter. Conversations become shorter. Smiles become forced. Questions remain unasked. Feelings are pushed aside until tomorrow. And somehow, two people can live in the same house, love each other deeply, and still feel completely alone with what they are carrying. That was the silence now settling over the family. What made the sudden absence of Prince Louis more obvious? What exactly has Prince Louis been known for? Stay tuned. Prince Louis's most unforgettable royal antics. There is something about Prince Louis that makes even the most carefully planned royal occasion feel completely unpredictable. While the rest of the royal family can usually be counted on for calm smiles, perfect posture, and carefully practiced waves, Louis seems to have his own set of rules. Give him a balcony, a carriage, or a grand ceremony, and there is always a chance that something unexpected will happen. Louis's playful personality began capturing attention when he was still very young. In 2019, during a family outing, he grabbed his mother Kate's sunglasses and immediately started pulling hilarious faces for the cameras. 3 years later, during Trooping the Color, Louis delivered another unforgettable moment. Standing on the Buckingham Palace balcony, the noise of passing aircraft became overwhelming, prompting him to cover his ears and scream while Kate tried to calm him. Later, during the carriage procession, his patience seemed to disappear altogether. As thousands waved from the streets, Louis looked visibly tired of royal greetings, giving spectators another glimpse of his mischievous personality. At the Platinum Jubilee pageant, however, Louis looked far more comfortable. He danced, waved his little finger, and threw himself into the excitement around him. Then Kate tried to correct him, and Louis responded in the most Louis-like way possible. He reached up and covered his mother's mouth, creating one of the most unforgettable moments of the celebration. By the following year, his reputation was firmly established. During Trooping the Color, Louis stretched his arms, pulled ridiculous faces, and appeared completely determined to break through the seriousness of the occasion. His parents could barely hide their laughter. On another carriage ride, he reportedly struggled to control his giggles, while his older siblings seemed much more focused on behaving properly. Then came King Charles's coronation. It was one of the most historic moments the young prince had ever witnessed. Everyone around him appeared focused on the solemn ceremony. Louis, meanwhile, looked as though the grandeur of the occasion had one small problem: it was making him sleepy. Cameras eventually caught him yawning, and somehow he still wasn't finished. At a 2023 Christmas Carol service, Louis was caught winking at people watching nearby, once again reminding everyone that he was never too far from another unexpected moment. But perhaps what makes Louis so charming is that he isn't simply interested in causing mischief. During a scout visit, for example, he eagerly tried his hand at archery, showing that his curiosity can be just as strong as his playful side. And maybe that's exactly why people love watching him. The royal family may be surrounded by centuries of tradition, ceremony, and strict expectations. But whenever Louis appears, he has a way of reminding everyone that beneath the crowns, titles, and formal clothes is still a little boy who simply wants to have fun. So, was Prince Louis able to understand what was happening around him? How did he react to the whole situation? Stay tuned. When Louis began questioning himself. At the center of this quiet change was 8-year-old Prince Louis, the youngest of the 3 Cambridge children, and perhaps the one least prepared to understand what was happening around him. Louis had always brought a completely different kind of energy into the family. He was the child who could turn a serious royal appearance into an unforgettable moment with one silly expression. He wriggled in his seat, pulled faces at the cameras, asked questions, and seemed almost incapable of hiding exactly what he was thinking. His playful behavior became so familiar that newspapers regularly turned his expressions into front-page stories. And because he was the youngest, his parents had never expected him to carry the same responsibilities as Prince George or Princess Charlotte. In many ways, that was a gift. Louis was allowed to simply be a child for a little longer, to laugh, play, make mistakes, and grow up away from the enormous expectations placed on the future king. But there was something his parents may not have been able to prepare him for: sudden change. One day, Louis simply stopped appearing in places where people had become accustomed to seeing him. There was no explanation that an 8-year-old could easily understand. No clear conversation that could answer every question running through his young mind. Instead, he noticed the little things. The house seemed quieter. Conversations became softer. Adults sometimes stopped talking when he walked into a room. Plans were discussed around him, but not always explained to him. And perhaps most importantly, he began noticing a pattern. Everyone else seemed to be going somewhere. Louis stayed behind. At first, he may have thought nothing of it. Then, he noticed it again and again. That is where a child's imagination can become both powerful and painfully cruel. When adults don't explain, children often create one of their own, and Louis, still far too young to understand the complicated reasons behind the changes, could have reached a devastating conclusion. Perhaps, he began to wonder, they were keeping him away because something was wrong with him. Maybe his parents were embarrassed by him. Maybe they didn't want people to see him. Think about how frightening that could feel to a child. He wasn't thinking about royal schedules, security concerns, family responsibilities, or adult decisions. He was simply looking at what was happening around him and trying to make sense of it. And the conclusion he reached had nothing to do with illness or misbehavior. It was about his worth. The very plan designed to protect Louis may therefore have created an entirely different problem. Instead of feeling protected, he could begin to feel unwanted. Instead of understanding that the adults were trying to shield him, he might only see that he was the one being left behind. And for an 8-year-old, that difference could feel enormous. But what did Catherine say about Prince Louis's sudden absence? How long did it take her to prepare her speech? Stay glued. Catherine refused to hide the truth. One night, long after the children had gone to bed and the house had finally fallen quiet, William and Catherine sat down for a conversation that would change the way they planned to speak about Louis. Catherine had spent days thinking about what she wanted to say. She hadn't written everything in one sitting. Instead, she returned to the pages again and again, carefully adding a sentence here, removing another there, until her thoughts finally became something she could place on paper. When she was finished, she laid the handwritten pages beside the official palace draft and asked William to read them. The palace statement was polished, cautious, and deliberately vague, offering reassurance while protecting the family's privacy. But Catherine felt it failed to reflect their real experience. Behind the carefully chosen words were fear, uncertainty, and emotional pain, especially the struggle of a little boy trying to regain his confidence. William read Catherine's first few lines and stopped. He shook his head. He reminded her of something important. Once words about a royal child entered the public record, they could remain there forever. Newspapers could repeat them. People could analyze them. Years later, strangers could still search for those words and form opinions about Louis without ever knowing him. Was she really prepared for that? For a moment, William's voice became sharper, but then the tension suddenly changed. They both understood what was happening. This wasn't really anger, it was fear. Catherine still refused to retreat. She wanted William to understand what Louis himself had come to believe during those difficult months. She pushed the official statement back across the table and pointed out what bothered her most. There was nothing in those carefully chosen sentences that sounded like their son. And Louis wasn't the only child who had been affected. George had become increasingly aware of the tension around him. He noticed the closed doors, the quiet conversations, and the moments when adults suddenly stopped talking as he entered a room. Charlotte had reacted differently. She had started speaking more softly and, in her own innocent way, began leaving little jokes and funny notes on Louis's bed. She seemed to understand something the adults already knew. Sometimes, bringing laughter back into a room was the first step toward making someone feel like themselves again. By the end of that night, William and Catherine had reached a difficult compromise. Catherine would speak, but there would be limits. She would protect the family's most private moments and keep certain details away from the public. At the same time, she would no longer hide behind perfectly polished words that made those painful months sound easier than they really were. For the first time, the palace statement would have something carefully controlled language could never manufacture, a trace of the truth. What did King Charles do when he got the draft? What was his final decision on the content of the draft? Why did he insist on his decision? Let's find out. When Charles finally heard Louis, it all came down to one person, King Charles. Later that evening, the draft statement was placed in front of him. Charles reportedly asked everyone else to leave before reading it carefully not once but twice. Yet one particular sentence kept drawing his attention. It referred to a child who might begin to mistake privacy for shame. For Charles, those words appeared to touch something much deeper. He had grown up inside a royal system, where difficult emotions were rarely discussed openly. Feelings were often pushed aside. Personal struggles were kept behind closed doors, and duty was expected to come before vulnerability. So the sentence forced Charles to confront a question that was uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Was this statement really about protecting Louis? Or were the adults, perhaps without realizing it, also trying to protect themselves from a painful truth? An edited version of the statement had removed the line expressing the child's own feelings. Charles reportedly refused to accept it. In his view, preserving the image of the institution could not come at the cost of silencing the child at the center of the story. And that decision changed the meaning of everything, because behind the polished royal photographs and carefully chosen words was a much more complicated family story. The exact reason for Louis's long absence remained private, but the events surrounding it appeared to leave emotional marks on those closest to him. An 11-year-old sister quietly tried to stand beside her brother. A frightened little boy may have begun wondering whether something was wrong with him. And Catherine, rather than relying on the carefully prepared words placed before her, reportedly allowed genuine emotion to break through. For William, the instinct to protect his children was understandable. His own childhood had taught him how painful royal life could become when private struggles were exposed to the world. He wanted to spare his children from experiencing that same pain. But sometimes, even love can have unintended consequences. Trying to protect a child by hiding everything can leave that child alone with questions they do not know how to answer. Catherine appeared to choose another path. Acknowledge the pain, speak honestly, and make the child understand that struggling does not make him weak or guilty. And Charles's refusal to erase that child's voice reinforced the same message. The public may never know the full truth behind Louis's difficult period. Perhaps they were never meant to, but one image seemed to say, enough. After everything that had happened, the little boy smiled again. And that smile became something far more powerful than an explanation, a quiet reminder that sometimes the first step toward healing is simply letting a child know, you are not the problem. So, what do you think about Prince Louis's sudden absence? Do you think King Charles was wrong to have rejected the explanation? We'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe.